Well, thanks very much, Eduardo. Let me just mention that I don't speak Portuguese, so I'm assuming that Professor Palanda has said only nice things about me and didn't reveal any of my dark secrets. But it is good to be here. I am sorry I can't be there in person. My son-in-law, Carlos Godoy, tells me Porto Alegre is a very beautiful city. And in fact, he told me it has the most beautiful avenue in the world. So I'm looking someday to be able to walk down that avenue with some of you. But for now, let me begin by saying we obviously live in a very dangerous world. What happened last Friday in Paris is something that affects all of us. What I'm going to talk about to you now, however, is hopefully something that will have definitely a happy ending, a revolution that helps people. And as a matter of fact, we're in the month of November 2015, and this is pretty much 8 years to the day that this revolution that I'm going to be talking to you about began. It's a revolution that has to do with what we can see on screens and what we can do with screens. But like all revolutions, we have to go back into the past to see what this revolution has begun to change. Various ways of life that we became, as a species, very accustomed to. So let's go back in a time machine to the late 1960s. The late 1960s were another difficult time. The United States and many other countries were embroiled in the Vietnam War. And it was an unhappy time in particular for an author whose name was John Kennedy Toole. And obviously his first two names, John Kennedy, were the same name as our American president who had been assassinated a few years earlier. But John Kennedy Toole was an author. He wasn't a politician. And in the mid-1960s, he wrote a novel called A Confederacy of Dunces. That's a pretty interesting title for a novel. Well, Mr. Toole sent that novel to an editor of a big publishing house in New York City. And the editor said, I like this novel. Let me read it over carefully and let me get back to you pretty soon with the response of my publishing house. Well, it took more than pretty soon. It actually took over 2 years. And the response from the publishing house was, well, we think there's a lot of merit in the novel, but no, we're not going to publish it. For whatever reason. Publishers have all kinds of reasons for declining to print up and publish books. And if you are an unknown author, if this is your first novel or if this is your first nonfiction book, the odds are really very much against you. Well, John Kennedy Toole was devastated by that response. And a few years later, he took his own life. He committed suicide. Now, you can't blame the publisher 100% or even mostly for this author taking his life. And as a matter of fact, a lot of authors are turned down by publishers. But certainly the decision of that publisher didn't help. Well, a few years went by, and John Kennedy Toole's mother who had read the manuscript, had read the novel, kept thinking about it, and finally said to herself, I'm not going to let this novel languish in obscurity. And so she began sending the novel out to other publishers. They all turned the novel down. Eventually, Toole's mother brought the novel to a professor. And I know most of you are students, it's always a good idea to go to a professor if you have a problem, or most of the time it is. The professor later said that he from time to time received requests from people who wanted him to read their work, and he always said no, he was too busy. But there was something about this woman, he later said, that compelled him to read the novel. And he thought the novel was great. And so he brought it to his university press. Most universities have small presses, not as big as mainstream publishers, but they can print up thousands of books, get them out to newspapers for review, even get them into bookstores. This again was the 1970s. And the university press published the book, A Confederacy of Dunces. And the book became chosen as one of the best novels of the year. It went on to win the Pulitzer Prize, which is one of the major literary awards. The Pulitzer Prize is maybe second only to the Nobel Prize for Literature. And another big publisher, now seeing that the book was successful, took over the publication. And everybody lived happily after. Everybody, that is, except the author, who was no longer around to see what had become of his novel. Now, as I said, he was not the only person to be turned down by publishers. I could probably talk for hours. I could talk probably until tomorrow morning about all the authors who have been turned down by publishers who went on to have enormously successful books and careers. I'll just give you a few examples. Frank Herbert is the author of the Dune series, one of the greatest series in science fiction. For those of you who love science fiction, and I know Fabio does too, I consider the Foundation trilogy about the only trilogy that's better than the Dune trilogy. But that's saying a lot. That's how good the Dune trilogy was. It was turned down by 25 different publishers. And eventually a publisher did publish it, and Frank Herbert was still alive. So his story had a happy ending. It's not only fiction. There is a very well-known book, I don't know how well-known it is in Brazil, called Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. I know there are a lot of motorcycles in Brazil. There are a lot of motorcycles here in New York. This book is really a philosophy book. It was also written in the 1960s. The author is Robert Pirsig. He claims that the book was turned down by 129 different publishers. I got to tell you, I didn't know there are 129 publishers, but it was certainly turned down by a lot of publishers. And as a matter of fact, all of these things took place in the 1960s, but this has been going on for many, many years. One of my favorite all-time poems was written about 250 years ago. It's by a poet with a very simple English name, Thomas Gray. And his poem is entitled An Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard. And what the poem is really about are all the brilliant people who are buried in this churchyard, but nobody knows who they are, even though they were brilliant and talented. Maybe they were turned down by 25 different publishers. And there's one verse in particular in that poem which always struck me. Gray wrote, "Many a gem of purest ray serene, the dark, unfathomed caves of ocean bare. Many a flower was born to blush unseen and waste its sweetness in the desert air." And Gray in that poem also talks about all the mute, inglorious Miltons who are buried in that churchyard. In other words, people who may have had the talent of John Milton, who wrote Paradise Lost, Areopagitica, a great essay about free speech. But nobody knows who they are, because maybe they gave up after 20 publishers or 21 publishers. Maybe they gave up after just one turn down, as John Kennedy Toole did, but he didn't have a mother who believed in him. Maybe they were like Stephen King, another name from science fiction. His first novel, entitled Carrie, was also turned down by dozens of publishers. Stephen King was so upset he took the manuscript of that novel and he threw it in the wastebasket. He threw it into the trash. But his wife believed in him, and his wife took the novel out of the wastebasket and said to Stephen King, "You put so much work into this, you have to get this published." And so Stephen King did get that novel published. It's interesting, isn't it, that it was John Kennedy Toole's mother and Stephen King's wife who believed in their work when maybe they were despairing. Women may have more sense than men when it comes to this, unless the women are working for traditional publishers. I'll give you just one more example from the 1960s, and this shows how widespread this gatekeeping was and still is in many ways. How many people were affected by it? One of the things I do, in addition to writing science fiction and scholarly books and talking my head off, is I'm also a musician and a songwriter. And one of my favorite groups is the Beatles. I guess the Beatles are a lot of people's favorite groups. I was amazed to find out years ago that the Beatles were turned down by 25 different record companies. 25 different record companies. Think about what that means. They put on a record and they heard something like this. "You think you've lost your love? Well, I saw her yesterday." You know that song, "She Loves You." Sold millions and millions of records. Paul McCartney is singing it. And 25 tone-deaf people at record companies said, "No, I don't really hear it." So that was the 1960s. Things began to change a little bit, but not quite the revolution that I mentioned, which again begins in 2007. But in the 1970s, there was a beginning of an ability to publish without having to go through traditional publishers. And as a matter of fact, Marshall McLuhan, who Professor Polanda mentioned is someone I've studied at great length and worked with. I consider him the most brilliant person I've ever had the pleasure of working with, by the way. Well, in the late 1970s, in an essay which I actually wrote the preface to when I was just a graduate student, it's called The Laws of the Media, Marshall McLuhan noted that the Xerox turns everyone into a publisher. The full quote is, "The printing press made everyone a reader. The Xerox machine, or the photocopying machine, well, that makes everyone a publisher, because you don't need any publisher's permission to publish. If you go into, in the 1970s, a copy shop, as it was called back then, or you had a Xerox machine maybe in your office. However, like all of McLuhan's ideas, he was really talking not about his own time, but about a time that was still about 30 or so years into the future. This, by the way, is typical of McLuhan's work, and it's what frustrates people about McLuhan. It's why McLuhan has so many critics. Because when he said in 1962 that electricity is turning the world into a global village, they didn't have Skype in 1962. There was no way that I, sitting here in New York, could be talking to you in Porto Alegre in 1962. That just didn't exist then. So McLuhan, when he coined the phrase global village, he really, even though he was writing that in 1962, was somehow looking at our world today. Now, this almost sounds like science fiction. I'm not suggesting that McLuhan could literally see into the future, but he had such a profound understanding of human technology and human beings that he realized, getting back again to the Xerox machine making everyone a publisher, McLuhan saying this in the late 1970s, he realized that that's what would happen, that there would be technology that would allow authors to bypass the traditional publisher. And as a matter of fact, that's exactly what has been happening. It's been happening in many different ways. It's been happening for longer than 8 years, longer than since 2007 on Wikipedia, for example. On Wikipedia, as you know, anyone can write an article. Anyone can edit an article. And when Wikipedia began, a lot of professors said to their students, you better not give me any references from Wikipedia in the papers I assign you to write. I'm sorry to say those professors were idiots. And any professor who says that today is an idiot. Because as a matter of fact, the information on Wikipedia is as accurate as, well, back in 2004 and 2005, Nature magazine, which is one of the world's leading scientific journals, did a little study. They measured the amount of errors on, say, 10 different pages in the Encyclopedia Britannica. That was the world's leading printed encyclopedia. And they compared that to the errors on the same number of pages in Wikipedia. And what they found was there was almost no difference in the errors. So the idea that you need a gatekeeper to determine what's good, what the rest of the world can read, is just not the case. By the way, in the case of Wikipedia, what happened was the errors that were there were corrected by readers easily. Well, let's go just a few more years to November 2007. Now, were I there in person, I would say, who knows what revolution happened in 2007. And when I'm finished with this talk, I will be happy to answer questions. But since I'm not there in person, I'll tell you what happened in November 2007, in case you didn't know. Amazon began its Kindle publication program. Now, this was immediately recognized as a great benefit to readers. And that's true. You can order a book instantly on Amazon Kindle and get it delivered. And by the way, not only to your Kindle, you can download a free Kindle app which works on your laptop. It works on your smartphone. It works on your tablet. I sound like I'm doing an advertisement for Amazon. Hey, maybe I should. Maybe they pay me, but I would say it anyway, because it's true. You get your novel, you get a nonfiction book, you get your textbook that you need to read instantly. I remember going back to Isaac Asimov in the 1980s when he began writing more novels in his Foundation series. When the first novel, Foundation's Edge, came out, I rushed to the bookstore to get the novel. It wasn't such an inconvenience. The whole thing took me maybe about 30 minutes. But now you can just get that instantly. But the real revolution is not a revolution for readers, it's a revolution for authors. It's a revolution for all the mute, inglorious Miltons, all those gems of purest ray serene, all those flowers blushing unseen, because some moron in a publishing house didn't see their value. I hate to use the word moron. It reminds me of Donald Trump. That's the kind of thing that he says, but sometimes it's applicable. What the Kindle has done is it allows anyone to become an author. All of you can become authors. You don't have to do it that way if you don't want to. You could still send your book to a traditional publisher. There are still some advantages of traditional publishers. You get your book proofread by a professional editor. You get your book easily put into bookstores. A traditional publisher will give you some promotion, maybe about a month or so, and unless your book becomes a bestseller, that's it. But still, that's not bad. But on the other hand, you could be sending your book around for years to traditional publishers. And I have to tell you, I've had, more than a dozen books published by traditional publishers, science fiction novels and nonfiction books. But I saw pretty quickly the advantage of the Kindle revolution. I'll give you just one example. One of my best-known novels is called The Plot to Save Socrates. Now, that book was originally published by a big publisher. I received a nice big advance, that's money up front for the novel. The book sold, maybe 10 or 15,000 copies in the first couple of years. But then, it hardly sold at all. So I got the rights back for that book and put it up as a Kindle. And by the way, apropos of my talking to you and you in Brazil, just last month, a Portuguese translation of The Plot to Save Socrates was released, not through a traditional publisher. It was released through an organization called Babel Cube, and that brings authors and translators together, and the translator works on the book, and you can send the book to people who read that language, make sure that the translation is okay, and then the book is published digitally on Amazon. So here in 2015, 8 years after Kindle introduced the possibility of authors publishing directly, we now have millions of books that are available to people that would not have been available to people. Now, many of these books are no doubt not very good. Some of these books have become bestsellers. 50 Shades of Grey, which is a sort of a soft pornographic novel, that became a huge bestseller. It was made into a movie. And that was originally published on Kindle. In the realm of science fiction, we have someone like Hugh Howey and his Wool series. And he's published that just on Kindle. So I'm going to wrap this up because I want to leave some time for questions. But here's what I want you to sort of put somewhere in the back of your mind. Some of you may be writers, authors already. Others of you may have had ideas for something you wanted to write. You didn't yet get a chance to write it. It might be years before you write it. But when you do write it, for the first time in history, you have a chance of getting your work out to the world just about instantly. I mean, you write it in Word, you upload a doc or a docx file to Amazon. They can even help you put together a cover if you don't have a friend or a relative or you yourself are not able to create a cover. And it's published. Just think about that. For the first time in history, through a screen like this, you can defeat what Thomas Gray sadly noted 250 years ago. You don't have to blush unseen or shine your light at the bottom of a dark ocean where no one else can see it. So I look forward to reading some of your work in times to come, and I thank you for listening to my talk.
So thank you very much, Paul, for the talk and very inspiring. Vocês, just a second. Vocês podem fazer perguntas, por favor, mandando papelzinho e A gente vai chegando aqui, vai lendo. Enquanto isso, eu vou fazer a primeira pergunta. Let me make the first question as they write in their questions.
Sure.
You are on the first to talk about cell phones in a book called Cell Phone. More than 10 years ago, I think, much before iPhones and other fashion new devices. And you are talking about the Kindle now that is completing 80 years right now. In this period, you talk about new devices and this is a new medium. And how do you think this in this period the message is evolving, doing a kind of McLuhan way of thinking? How the book is evolving and how other messages evolving in these new mediums? It's very spread right now, and people are publishing differently with this spread media. What do you think about that?
Well, first of all, I'm glad you mentioned the cell phone, which I did write that book before the iPhone. So I like to think maybe I inspired the iPhone, because one of the things I said in that book, which has become true, is that with the cell phone, what we now call a smartphone, it doesn't matter where you are in the physical world. You have complete access to everything on the internet. And that's an amazing development in its own way. I mean, obviously, again, we saw what happened in Paris on our phones almost literally as it was happening. And this, again, is another example of the global village becoming real. It's no longer a metaphor. It's real. We're really doing this. As far as what impact this is going to have on the evolution of the book, here's what I think is going to happen. We are coming out of a history which goes all the way back to the beginning of the human species. It goes back to Neanderthals. It goes back to whatever it was that existed even before then. And in all of those years, up until literally the last 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 years, only a very small percentage of human beings could get their ideas out to the world. Now, we've done very well in many ways in the world. We have cured diseases, we've cured smallpox, we've cured polio, we've created great music, so the Beatles did finally break through. We've done all kinds of wonderful things. But I often think about how much more can we accomplish as a species in terms of doing good things when we can finally unleash on the world what so many people are carrying around in their heads, in their hearts, in their souls, but are not able to express to the world. That is, they've not been able to do it until now in just the past few years. So I can't predict what actually is going to happen, but I think we're beginning to see the floodgates open up. I think more and more people are writing. Comenius, a great philosopher of the Renaissance, talked about the great dialogue, and he was talking about philosophers talking back and forth to each other and able to put their words in writing, and a few books were printed up. The great dialogue, I think, is now finally becoming great in terms of the great number of minds that can take part in it. So I'm very hopeful.
Fabio and Francisco, do you want to make a question?
Ok, então, ok, bom, eu vou perguntar em português para que o intérprete possa fazer a parte dele. Pô, boa, excelente fala, adorei as coisas que você falou tem uma coisa que eu gostaria que você pudesse desenvolver um pouco mais, né? Você falou no decorrer, né, da sua fala que a imprensa, né, a impressora, ela criou o leitor, Ela abre a possibilidade de haver mais leitores no mundo. Na sequência, segundo McLuhan, o processo de fotocópia, o processo de xerox, vai criar, fazer com que todos nós sejamos editores. E o processo da criação da web, né, particularmente depois do Kindle e tudo mais, faz com que todos nós sejamos autores. Queria que você falasse só um pouco mais da sua experiência, né, com The Plot to Save Socrates. É o seguinte, como é que fica? Nós entendemos que no primeiro momento a figura do livreiro, do dono de livraria, que faz a distribuição, no primeiro momento ela já não existe ou não existe como nós a concebíamos, graças ao trabalho da Amazon.com, por exemplo. Em que medida isso, neste momento, está sendo uma coisa realmente eficiente para a questão financeira? É uma pergunta de caráter logístico. Financeiramente, isso está sendo realmente eficaz para o autor, já que todos nós somos autores?
Como não tem feedback, eu vou traduzir. Well, Paul, let me try to translate a little bit. The idea is that you are made in the idea of the printing press make readers, the Xerox machine, the Xerox machine make copies, and all this new way to spread the information as a Kindle that you just talked today, make this spread information. And the question is very simple, it's very specific about how this also influencing the small publishers and small bookshops, and how this affect them, how this could also be not the so good side of this way of publishing stuff, because you're quoting a lot Amazon, and Amazon have new ways to distribute the content, distribute the devices, but and how about small publishers, how to make money being a small also authors and small publisher and bookshopper?
Okay, well, first, about the printing press, let me just say it really did create a profound revolution. Let me just mention a few things that came about as a result of the printing press. One is very relevant to both of us here in the Western Hemisphere. Columbus sailed across the ocean in 1492. But the Vikings actually got to North America around 1000 AD. But nothing much happened to civilization after the Vikings got here. But after Columbus got here, his son Diego wrote basically an essay about his father's work. It became a bestseller in Europe, and the age of discovery was the result. So you could say the printing press led in many ways to the Western Hemisphere joining a world civilization. And there are many other examples. But about the question of what is Amazon and the Kindle revolution going to do to small bookstores? Well, let me first mention that, at least in this country, in America, small bookstores were nearly wiped out completely by the huge mega chain bookstores such as Barnes & Noble and Borders. And there was a time in the late 1990s that people were saying, you know, we're not going to see small bookstores anymore. So if anything, Amazon, by knocking out Borders, by pushing Barnes & Noble back, has created more space for small bookstores. And I know that people constantly say, well, you know, Amazon has a monopoly, is that going to stifle the free exchange of ideas? But actually, even though I mentioned, the Amazon Kindle, because that's the best example, you can get ebooks instantly on Barnes & Noble's own site, on iTunes, on half a dozen other sites, Kobo. You probably know of some sites that I don't even know about. So I think that this revolution that I'm talking about is actually going to help small bookstores. In the end, paper books, as we know them, either paperback or hardcovers, will survive, I'm sure of it, because they do something, and this is a key to why any medium survives. They do something that digital books can't do. They have what I call reliable locatability. If you know where you put your book on the bookshelf, it's going to be there next week, it's going to be there next year, it's going to be there 10 years from now. And if you know what's on page 35, it's going to continue to be on page 35. That's not the case with digital books because, as we know, digital information is very easily lost. It can get distorted. We might, have a new system that doesn't read the earlier information well. So there will continue to be a need for hardcover and paperback books. And I think actually small bookstores will do a better job of making those available to people than the big chains like Barnes & Noble.
Well, you have two different questions here. One is specifically about the Wikipedia. My colleague Liana Forini asked you about how about the process of everyone be an author, or actually the author is not very show in the Wikipedia. Actually is hiding the author. What about that? No author in the Wikipedia.
That's an excellent question. And that, by the way, is why I don't do much on Wikipedia, because I'm too egotistical. I want my name associated with everything that I write. Otherwise, I'm not going to write it. It's as simple as that. But not everybody feels that way. And there are a lot of people, I admit, I don't understand them, but they get satisfaction in doing work on Wikipedia where their name is not associated. And as a matter of fact, one of those people is my own wife, Tina Vazek, who does political editing on Wikipedia. She helps edit Hillary Clinton's page. She only edits Democrats. She doesn't like Republicans. But, I often say to her, nobody knows that you have done that. And she says, well, that's okay. I'm just, trying to do something to help out. She does it, once in a while when she has a little spare time. So it is a different kind of writing. And yes, if we care about author attribution, that's a very good question, because author attribution is not something you get on Wikipedia. I would like to see Wikipedia change and give everyone credit for what they do. There is, by the way, you can click on the history of any article and see who made the changes, but in almost all cases, they're just like, they're worse than even Twitter names. They're just all kinds of names that people make up. So I think a good change for Wikipedia, but nobody ever listens to me, is they should insist that everybody who edits have their own name there, and then we would know who the author is.
And the three last questions, I think you can join together. The idea is that they are worried about how much information we have right now. So there is two problems. One problem that what kind of social revolution could this would be, and also how we can curate this kind of content. If so many books, so many publishing, so many content, how we can curate all this content?
Well, this is a traditional question that is always raised in these circumstances. And another way of putting the question is, well, one good thing that traditional publishers did is they separated out, the expression here in America is the wheat from the chaff. In other words, the good grain from the husks. That's what traditional publishing did, so that we, the public, would only get good information. But again, the problem with that is, what traditional publishers did is they also didn't allow wheat to get published. They had such a poor, and still have such a poor way of deciding what's good and bad, that a lot of good material, that's why I gave those examples at the beginning. A Pulitzer Prize winning novel, the Beatles, their early music were turned down by these traditional publishers. But that said, there's still, yes, you could ask the question, well, how are we human beings going to deal with so much information? This is what it's been called the information overload problem. And I have a solution to the problem. First of all, part of the solution resides in how the human brain works. Now, at the end of the 19th century, an American philosopher in Harvard University by the name of William James said the human mind makes sense of the big, booming, buzzing confusion of the world. That's what our minds do. We are inherently multitasking people. We can handle many more things than we're sometimes told that we can. The authorities, whether it's in universities, whatever the authority is, always wants to just give us a little information. And we as children can handle much more information. In addition to that, the key to dealing with information overload is just coming up with ways that we can better navigate all this information. So Amazon is trying, but it's still early days. But that's why Amazon has, the various categories that they put their books in and the subcategories. So if you're interested in a certain kind of book, you can pretty easily search and find it. Finally, what this plethora of information has done is it's given us the ability to check on whatever information we get. We don't have to accept it. So again, to get back to what was going on in Paris, when the initial reports came out, nobody quite knew what was going on. You could be watching one television channel, you could switch to another, you could go on to Twitter, you could go on to Facebook. And yes, it was an enormous, and still is, an enormous amount of information to process, but our brains are good at picking out truth from falsity. And so I think in the long run, this is a very good thing for democracy, because our citizens are going to be better informed than they ever were before.
Well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we have running out of the time, but thank you very much for this inspiring talk, and nice that everything works fine, and the connection and everything else. You hope to see you in present next time.
I hope so. Looking forward to shaking your hand and everybody else in the room next time.
Thank you. Bye.
Take care.
Have a nice
Bye-bye.
night.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Thank you. Adios.